Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. You are on the Steady Coach. Welcome to another episode of Ask Dr. Yo, an unedited series in which I answer your questions. And this is a very important question because of all things that happen during chronic dizziness recovery. This is probably the thing that makes people panic the most. And that is, why do my symptoms keep going up and down? Secondarily, does this mean I'm doing something wrong? What do I do about this dip? Does this mean I'm not going to recover? So, we're going to get into all that. But to quote Douglas Adams, first and foremost, don't panic. This is normal. This happens to everyone who is recovering from chronic dizziness. Everyone. No exceptions that I've ever seen. And I will amend this video if I ever see someone who doesn't go through ups and downs. Still hasn't happened. It doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It doesn't mean that you're on the wrong path. It doesn't mean that you're the only one who won't recover. It means that your brain is doing what brains do. And brains are very complicated. And this process of rewiring yourself out of symptoms is a complicated process. So keep doing the things that you're already doing. Keep responding to the sensations with less fear, with more neutrality. Keep doing things that make your world bigger instead of smaller. Keep increasing the sense of safety in your life. Keep relating to yourself with self compassion. You are going to get better and you're going to get through this dip. So, if that's what you needed to hear today, you are dismissed. Please feel free to shut off the video. You don't need to hear anything else. But if you want to know a little bit more about why dips happen, I'm here for that too. We're going to talk about 3 reasons today. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to give you some tips and pointers on what you can do with this information to help yourself through the dip. So, reason number 1 why dips happen is the easy one. It's the obvious one. But for it to be easy and obvious, you have to understand a little bit of the basics of neural circuit dizziness. So, really quick primer here. Ultimately, if you're having chronic dizziness symptoms, it's because your brain is making prediction errors. It's making mistakes. It is not correctly using information from your senses to draw conclusions about your balance system. And for some of you, this happened because originally you had some kind of biological issue that meant that your brain's expectations didn't match what your senses were actually telling your brain. And your brain just never corrected that template. And for some of you, your brain started making prediction errors all on its own. There was never any known biological cause for your original symptoms. This video applies to all of you. So, whether you've had neuritis, BPPV, or some other kind of vestibular event, or if you have a symptom based diagnosis like PPPD, this applies to you as well. So, oh, and I guess I should also include those of you with MDDS whose symptoms were brought on by motion. This applies to you as well. We're going to count that as kind of like a physical cause of original symptoms. When you have chronic symptoms, though, this is universally what's happening. Your brain is making prediction errors and it's not correcting the predictions. So, in a normal system, what will happen is someone will have prediction errors. And by the way, when I say normal system, I don't mean just dizziness, I mean any sensory system. Someone will have some kind of prediction error and then the brain will correct it. So, for example, my daughter might bring me a bowl of oatmeal and say, "Ooh, I brought you this oatmeal." And I might expect it to be apple flavored. And then I might taste it and it tastes completely wrong as I realize that it's peach oatmeal instead of apple oatmeal. And then as I eat it, I'm like, delicious peach oatmeal. So, in other words, I was expecting apple. It tasted really weird because it ended up not being apple. But then once I realize it's peach oatmeal, my expectations are adjusted and now it tastes like peach instead of like blah. Okay. So, simple example. So, what drives this process, and this is what I talk about a lot here on the channel, is these prediction errors are much more likely to happen. They happen when your brain is generally predicting threat. And It can predict threat about physical triggers like movement, like being in a supermarket, like looking at a moving object. And it can predict threat about other things in your life, stressors, emotions, relationships. When your brain is in the habit of predicting threat about other stressors in your life, it's going to be much more likely to predict threat about physical triggers as well. So, when your brain is in danger mode, that's what I call it. When your brain is biased toward predicting threat, when it's used to predicting threat, it is much more likely to predict threat and associate threat with physical triggers like movement, like vision, like being outside. Okay. So, this is essentially what causes this ongoing cycle of predicting threat and predicting dizziness or mispredicting balance information, really, that causes chronic dizziness. Now, I have a video about this that's 15 minutes long that goes into a little more depth. So please watch that if you have more questions or if this didn't make sense. I will link to that in the video description below or in the podcast description if you're listening to this as a podcast. Okay, so now that we've talked about that, reason number one, the obvious reason, is obvious because if threat mode is what's driving this whole process, anything that brings on threat mode can drive this process. So things that stress you out, things that are actually threatening can immediately turn symptoms on. And for some of you, this happens. This is what it looks like. I had an argument with my spouse, boom, symptoms came on. I got really stressed out because I had a work project due. Boom, symptoms came on. I'm anxious all the time about lots of other things, and my symptoms are occurring all the time. Threat mode is just constantly leading to symptoms. So, those are the obvious things. These are the obvious causes of dips. So, when it comes to dips, what's happening in this obvious case, in reason number one, is some kind of threat is poking you in the threat mode. And that is turning that chronic dizziness cycle on again, or it's making it more intense. So, things to look for in these cases would be emotional stressors, relationship stressors, self relating stressors. So, in how you talk to yourself. So, sometimes an emotional stressor might be super obvious, like, oh, I lost a pet. But sometimes it's less obvious, like, something relatively normal happened and now I'm criticizing myself and ruminating about it for 3 hours, right? So those are, or 3 years, I suppose, but 3 hours. So those are obvious sources of threat. Now, for some of you, they're not going to be so obvious. And so this is why I think it's very important if you have a dip to at least ask yourself the question, what's been going on in my life over the last few days? Is there something here? Often there is. And great. Once you know what it is, it makes it a lot easier to address the stressor. And as you address the stressor, your nervous system's going to calm down, threat mode's going to come down, the symptoms are going to calm down as well. But where we run into trouble is that for many of you, these stressors are not obvious. So you'll think back on the last 3 days or the last 4 days or the last week, and you'll be like, I don't know, everything was going really well. This doesn't make any sense. Like there was no source of threat. And some of you will actually drive yourselves nuts trying to figure out what it was that stressed you out. So the reasons number 2 and 3 address this. So I hope again that this brings some solace to you and some calm to you, knowing that sometimes it's not going to be an obvious stressor or something right now that you need to fix. Okay. Really important take home message right there. So reason number 2 why dips happen is that essentially stress is cumulative. Okay. So I talk about the stress bucket as a great metaphor. I think you can tell me in the comments if you agree with me, but the stress bucket basically holds all of your life stressors, physical and emotional. So maybe you were really hungry and you didn't sleep well last night. And you also have some unresolved childhood patterns that are leading you to be kind of a jerk to yourself and feel really stressed out about work and become a huge perfectionist. Okay. And then let's just say your neighbor yelled at you and you had a really bad day at work, or you and your spouse had an argument, or you feel really guilty about not taking care of your kids the way you want to take care of your kids. Stay tuned, by the way. I'm going to have some specific content for parents coming up. So, all of those things go in your stress bucket. And as you can tell, all of these things are cumulative. And sometimes we reach a point at which our stress bucket is full within like a millimeter of the top. And so we're not really in fight or flight. We're not really in threat mode yet, but we're like this close to the threshold. When that happens, a small, innocuous, innocent little stressor can send us over the edge into threat mode. I lost my toothbrush, or I didn't sleep quite as well as I needed to, or someone looked at me wrong, or I just had this fleeting thought like, wow, I'm really kind of slacking at work. It can be something so innocuous and small because we're so close to the top of the stress bucket already because of all the other stuff that's already happened. You can then overflow the bucket. In other words, go back into threat mode, reactivate symptoms, or make symptoms worse. So I know some of you have constant symptoms. Dips don't require you to have intermittent symptoms. It can happen when you have constant symptoms. What I mean by dip is it either gets worse or symptoms show up. Okay. So that's one way of thinking about it. Reason number 3 is a little bit of a different take on this same idea. So, reason number 3 is that stress also causes cumulative physiologic changes. So, over time, we have wear and tear on our bodies from moving and living our lives for sure. And we also have wear and tear on our bodies from the cumulative effects of stress. And by the way, when I say stress, I mean stress that is ongoing and feels unresolved. Okay. So we have this cumulative stress. It can affect the systems that are involved in the balance system. Again, remember the balance system is really complicated. It uses 3 sensory systems and it is easily affected by other systems in your body as well. Your body is a very complicated machine, and the balance system is a component of that very complicated machine. So, if there's a physiologic change that just happens to affect the balance system, if your stress bucket is not overflowing, then your brain is going to take that change in stride. It's going to say, okay, cool, getting a little bit of a different nerve signal than I was before. Cool, just need to adjust the template. Everything's fine. If we're already a millimeter from the top of the stress bucket, and then we have this cumulative change that's occurred, and things are now just a little bit different from what they used to be, and we reach this critical point at which it's different enough from how things used to be that your brain notices, your brain is much more likely to overreact to that and go into major threat response. All the alarms go off and send you back into a symptom dip or into symptoms altogether. So again, slightly different take. The point being here that physiologically, your bodies are changing all the time. Our bodies are constantly changing. Our brains are constantly adjusting their templates, their expectations based on our physiology. You want a brain that's relatively flexible. Stress, and by stress, I mean the things that go into your stress bucket, which include, in many cases, a lot of emotional stuff that's occurred to us our entire lives. That makes our brains less flexible and less able to adjust our templates. Okay, so all of these things are now out there. You have all 3 reasons. So now what do you do about it? Okay, so if it's number 1, we need to address the stressor directly. If it's number 1 and you know what the stressor is, you can address the stressor. And I have entire videos on how to address different things like anxiety, like relationships, like emotions. You can check out the videos that I have on those topics. That I've exhausted the methods already. But when it comes to the second 2, this is where things actually should feel a lot easier to you now. The reason they should feel easier to you now is because many people feel like they're under stress to find the exact correct stressor, stressing about finding the stressor, which is also really a source of stress too and not helpful. They feel like, okay, I have to figure out what the cause of this dip is to fix it. Whereas the message that I should be giving you now, after you've heard and understood reasons number 2 and 3, we're dealing with the stress bucket, not a single cause of stress. No one has one single cause of their dizziness. It's never one thing. So anything that you do to get stress out of your bucket is going to help you. So, my suggestion here is if you look back on the last few days and you say to yourself, there really isn't anything that I can pinpoint that's really causing my stress to accumulate. What's probably happening here is some small stressor just kind of sent me back into threat mode. And my job is to keep working on all the other things that are getting me into threat mode in the first place. And the biggest items in your stress buckets are going to be different for each of you. But from my perspective, the biggest item in someone's bucket is usually the way that that person relates to him or herself. So, the way that you talk to yourself, the way that you treat yourself, the way that you respond when you are having a dip, the way that you respond when you feel anxious about having a dip, the way that you relate to yourself overall. That is the biggest source of danger in your life because you're with yourself 24 hours a day. Again, not playing light at all of the fact that some of you are in difficult life situations where the danger is coming from the outside. But in many cases, the reason the danger coming in from the outside is affecting you as much as it is because it has a place to land. And often that's in the way that we relate to ourselves. So I have a lot more to say about this, but this video is already long enough. So the point here, the overall take home message is this is where in the dips, you say to yourself, this is normal. Is there a stressor that might be affecting me? I don't see it. Okay, cool. Or if you do see it, address it. But if I don't see it, you say, cool. I already know what I'm doing here. I already know the strategies that I'm going to use to address the stress bucket. Yonit talks about them ad nauseum elsewhere on her channel. I might go back to the course, repeat steps 3 and 4, where I'm working on my reactions to the symptoms, starting to feel my emotions, and start working through the stressors that are really sitting in your bucket and making you sensitive to changes like this. Over time, your bucket level is going to go down and down and down. And then small stressors like changes in weather and changes in where your toothbrush is located aren't going to affect you the way that they're affecting you right now. I hope this was helpful. And again, if you're going through a dip, I'm sorry, it stinks. And I really, really wish this weren't part of chronic dizziness recovery, but it is. You're not alone. You're doing it right. Keep going. If you have any questions or comments for me, please drop them below. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this, please give it a like, please share it, subscribe to my channel, follow the podcast if you're listening to this as a podcast. All of these things really help me reach more people. Take care, everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye.